The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the Channel 8 studio as the production team hurried around, preparing for another episode of Straight Talk with Richard. Coffee cups littered the tables, and the smell of hairspray filled the air as makeup artists put final touches on the host's face. Richard Brooks sat in his chair, scrolling through his phone, occasionally barking orders at interns who scurried by. At 52, with his silver-streaked hair and expensive suit, he looked every bit the successful media personality he'd become over the last decade. His show consistently ranked #1 in its time slot, largely because of his no-holds-barred approach to interviews and his willingness to speak truths others are afraid to say. At least, that's how he described it. In reality, Richard had built his career on controversy, dog whistles, and thinly veiled racist commentary that he cleverly disguised as honest conversation. His viewers, mostly middle-aged white conservatives, loved him for it. The network executives, while occasionally uncomfortable with his rhetoric, couldn't argue with the advertising dollars he brought in. 5 minutes to air, called the floor director, a young woman who'd learned to steel herself against Richard's occasional inappropriate comments. Richard's producer, Trent, approached with a tablet in hand. "So big show today," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and nervousness. "The ratings are going to be through the roof." "Who wouldn't tune in?" Richard chuckled, smoothing his tie. "Everyone wants to see how this guy will react when I corner him on the real issues." The guy in question was Anthony Thompson, founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies, a company valued at over $2 billion. Thompson had agreed to come on the show to discuss economic policy and innovation in the American marketplace. But Richard had other plans. Behind the studio's heavy doors, in a small waiting room, Anthony adjusted his cufflinks. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had overcome countless obstacles. His company had revolutionized affordable healthcare technology, and his personal story, growing up in public housing before putting himself through college and eventually founding a tech empire, had been featured in business magazines nationwide. "Mr. Thompson, they're ready for you," said a production assistant, not quite meeting his eyes. Anthony nodded, taking a deep breath. He knew exactly what kind of show this was. He had watched enough episodes to understand Richard's tactics. The leading questions, the interruptions, the subtle and not-so-subtle implications about Black Americans. Most guests came unprepared, fell into his traps, or lost their temper, all outcomes that boosted Richard's ratings. But Anthony hadn't built a billion-dollar company by being unprepared. Back in the studio, the lights brightened as the countdown began. Richard put on his television smile, practiced, wide, never reaching his eyes. 3, 2, 1. The floor director pointed, and the cameras went live. "Good evening, America. Welcome to another edition of Straight Talk. I'm Richard Brooks, and tonight we have a special guest." The way he emphasized special made it clear what he really meant. "We'll be talking with Anthony Thompson, who's done quite well for himself despite coming from, shall we say, challenging circumstances." The studio audience chuckled, picking up on Richard's tone. In the control room, the director winced but kept the cameras rolling. This was the Richard Brooks Show, after all. Controversy meant viewers, and viewers meant money. As Anthony walked onto the set, the audience applauded politely. He buttoned his suit jacket, custom-made but not flashy, and smiled genuinely at both Richard and the audience. If he was offended by the introduction, he didn't show it. "Thank you for having me, Richard," he said, his voice steady and warm. Richard shook his hand with a grip that was slightly too firm, a small power play that Anthony noticed but ignored. "Sir, Mr. Thompson," Richard began, leaning forward with an expression of exaggerated interest. "You've made quite a name for yourself. I have to ask, in your opinion, why don't we see more success stories like yours from certain communities?" And there it was, the first trap, barely 2 minutes into the interview. The audience shifted in their seats, eagerly awaiting the response. The cameraman zoomed in on Anthony's face, expecting discomfort or anger. Instead, Anthony smiled slightly. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. What Richard didn't know was that this interview wouldn't go like any other he'd done before. 3 hours before the show, Richard sat in his office with his production team. The large window behind his desk offered a view of the city skyline, but no one was admiring the view. They were focused on their tablets, reviewing research compiled for the Anthony Thompson interview. "Look," Richard said, pointing to a document on the conference table. "We need to push him on these crime statistics. Ask him to explain why his community can't get it together." He smirked as he flipped through more papers. "And make sure the graphics team has these welfare dependency charts ready to go. I want them up as soon as I bring up the topic." Trent nodded, though something in his expression suggested discomfort. But Richard, the agreed topic was economic innovation and Thompson's business model. His PR team was very clear. "I don't care what his PR team wants," Richard cut in, leaning back in his leather chair. "My audience doesn't tune in to hear some guy brag about his success. They want real talk about real problems." He tapped his fingers on the armrest. "Besides, don't you think it's interesting that this guy made it while so many others don't? There's a story there." A younger producer named Liz spoke up. "I've actually read up on Thompson. His business approach is pretty revolutionary. Maybe we could focus on—" "Listen," Richard interrupted again. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what works." He stood up and straightened his tie. "Just have the facts ready when I need them. This guy thinks he's coming on to talk business, but I'm going to show everyone what's really going on." As the team dispersed, Trent lingered. "Thompson isn't like your usual guests, Richard. He's prepared. I heard he's been studying your previous interviews." Richard laughed. "Good. Let him come prepared. It'll make for better television when he breaks." Meanwhile, in a hotel room across town, Anthony was having a very different kind of preparation session. Spread across the king-sized bed were printouts of Richard's previous interviews, with key passages highlighted. On the desk sat Anthony's laptop, open to a spreadsheet filled with facts and figures about his company, his personal journey, and the economic barriers faced by minority entrepreneurs. His media advisor, Wei, sat in an armchair reviewing notes. "He's going to try to derail you," Wei said. "Based on his history, he'll likely ignore the economic discussion and push you on social issues that have nothing to do with your business." Anthony nodded, adjusting his glasses as he studied a transcript. "I've watched every episode from the last 6 months. His pattern is pretty clear. Open with a backhanded compliment, follow with a leading question about cultural problems, then interrupt before his guest can fully respond." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same skyline visible from Richard's office, but seeing it with very different eyes. 15 banks turned me down before I got funding for Horizon. One loan officer actually told me that people like me usually don't succeed in tech." He shook his head. "I've been dealing with people like Richard my whole life. The difference is, this time I get to respond on national television." Wayne looked concerned. "Just remember, if you lose your cool, that's exactly what he wants." "I won't," Anthony said with quiet determination. "But I'm not going to sit there and let him control the narrative either. I brought receipts." He gestured toward a leather portfolio on the nightstand. "Loan rejection letters with racist comments in the margins. Statistics on funding disparities. Security footage from that time I was followed by store security while wearing a $3,000 suit." He sat down on the edge of the bed, his expression serious but calm. "People need to see what this really looks like. Not just his audience, but everyone who's watching." Wayne nodded slowly. "Just be careful. Men like Richard don't take well to being challenged." Anthony smiled slightly. "I didn't build a billion-dollar company by avoiding challenges." He glanced at his watch. 2 hours until showtime. Let's go through the economic talking points one more time, and then I want to review those unemployment statistics again." As they worked, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. "Show him who you are, Dad. We're all watching." With renewed purpose, Anthony straightened his shoulders and returned to his preparation. Unlike Richard's previous guests, he wasn't coming to defend himself. He was coming to change the conversation. Back at the studio, the production team bustled about, testing lighting and sound levels. The audience began to file in, many of them regular viewers who loved Richard's confrontational style. Little did they know, they were about to witness something entirely different from the usual show. This wouldn't be an ambush, it would be a reckoning. The studio lights blazed hot as the on-air sign flashed red. Camera operators moved with practiced precision while the floor director counted down silently with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to Straight Talk with Richard. The host's voice boomed through the studio, his perfect teeth gleaming under the lights. Tonight, we're joined by a special guest who's been making waves in the business world. The camera panned to Anthony, who sat with perfect posture in the guest chair, his expression neutral but attentive. Anthony Thompson, Richard continued, emphasizing each syllable with a hint of mockery, who rose from the housing projects to become CEO of Horizon Technologies. He paused dramatically. Quite a journey, wouldn't you say? The studio audience, mostly middle-aged and predominantly white, murmured appreciatively. Many were regular viewers who came specifically to watch Richard tell it like it is, as he often claimed. "Thank you for having me, Richard," Anthony replied, his voice steady and warm. He made deliberate eye contact with both Richard and the cameras. "I'm looking forward to our discussion about economic innovation." Richard gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, economic innovation. But first, I think our viewers would be interested in your background." He shuffled some papers on his desk, though he didn't actually look at them. "You grew up in Westside Heights, isn't that right? An area known for its high crime rates and, let's be honest, cultural challenges." A few audience members chuckled. In the control room, Trent winced but kept the cameras rolling. "I grew up in a working-class neighborhood," Anthony corrected gently, "where many hard-working families did their best despite facing significant economic and social barriers." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "Yet somehow you managed to escape, while so many others remain trapped in cycles of poverty and crime. What makes you different from the rest of your community?" The emphasis on your community hung in the air. A woman in the third row shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Anthony leaned forward slightly. "I don't think I'd escaped anything, Richard, and I certainly don't consider myself different or special." His voice remained even. "What I had was a mother who worked 3 jobs to support us, a community library with free internet access, and a few key teachers who believed in me." Yes, the usual thank yous," Richard interrupted, clearly annoyed that Anthony wasn't taking the bait. "But surely you must acknowledge that there are cultural issues at play. After all, if a kid from Westside Heights can make it big, why can't others? Is it just a lack of personal responsibility?" The camera zoomed in on Anthony's face, expecting, hoping, for signs of anger or discomfort. Instead, Anthony smiled slightly. "That's an interesting framing, Richard," he said, folding his hands in his lap. "But I think it misses the larger context. Would you mind if I shared some actual data about entrepreneurship in America?" Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off by the calm response. This wasn't how these segments usually went. His guests typically got defensive or emotional by now. "By all means," he said with exaggerated politeness, "enlighten us." Anthony nodded. "The data shows that minority entrepreneurs receive less than 3% of venture capital funding, despite making up about 40% of the population. Black business owners are rejected for loans at twice the rate of white owners, even when controlling for credit score and business performance." He spoke clearly and confidently, without a hint of anger or defensiveness. The audience, expecting fireworks, instead found themselves listening attentively. Richard's smile tightened. "Well, perhaps there are reasons for those disparities. After all, banks aren't in the business of losing money." "You're right that banks want to protect their investments," Anthony agreed, surprising Richard with the concession. "But that doesn't explain why identical business plans receive different treatment based solely on the owner's race." He paused. "Would you like me to share some specific examples from my own experience?" The camera caught a glimpse of uncertainty in Richard's eyes. This wasn't going according to plan. He glanced toward the production booth, where Trent was making a wrap-it-up gesture. They needed to break for commercials soon. "We'll get to your anecdotes after the break," Richard said, his voice slightly strained. "When we return, more straight talk with Anthony Thompson about success, culture, and personal responsibility. Don't go away." As the on-air sign darkened, Richard's smile vanished. He tapped his earpiece. "Trent, what the hell? This guy is totally off script." In the guest chair, Anthony remained composed, taking a sip of water. The first round had gone exactly as he'd expected, and he was just getting started. During the commercial break, makeup artists rushed to touch up both men's faces. Richard drummed his fingers on his armrest, irritation visible in the tight set of his jaw. He leaned over to whisper to his floor producer, "Get me those crime statistics we prepared. This guy thinks he can control my show with his corporate talk." The producer nodded and hurried off. Across the stage, Anthony sat quietly, reviewing notes on his phone. A production assistant offered him water, which he accepted with a smile. Unlike Richard, who grew more tense by the minute, Anthony appeared completely at ease. "Back in 30 seconds," called the floor director. Richard straightened his tie and plastered on his television smile. "Let's see how calm he stays when I hit him with some hard truths," he muttered to himself. The on-air light flashed red again, and the cameras rolled. "Welcome back to Straight Talk," Richard began. "We're talking with Anthony Thompson, CEO of Horizon Technologies." He shuffled the papers that had been rushed to him during the break. "Mr. Thompson, before the break you were about to tell us about your personal experiences. But I think our viewers would benefit from some context first." Richard gestured and a graphic appeared on the screen behind them, a bar chart showing crime statistics by neighborhood. "As you can see," he continued, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "areas like Westside Heights, where you grew up, have significantly higher crime rates than other parts of the city. Wouldn't you say this cultural environment is the real barrier to success for many people there?" A few audience members nodded in agreement. This was the Richard they had come to see, bold, unapologetic, asking questions other hosts wouldn't dare to ask. Anthony glanced at the graphic, then back at Richard. "I appreciate you bringing up these statistics, Richard," he said calmly. "They actually highlight exactly what I was trying to explain before." Richard blinked, caught off guard again. "They do." "Absolutely," Anthony continued. "These numbers reflect systemic issues, underfunded schools, lack of healthcare access, limited job opportunities, over-policing of minor offenses. When we talk about culture, we're often really talking about the consequences of these systemic problems." Richard frowned and cut in. "That sounds like making excuses. Plenty of people overcome difficult circumstances without resorting to crime or depending on welfare." "You're right that many people overcome enormous obstacles," Anthony agreed. "I was fortunate enough to be one of them. But that doesn't mean the obstacles should exist in the first place." He turned slightly to address the audience directly. "Imagine running a race where some participants have to hurdle barriers while others run on a clear track. Yes, some hurdlers will still win, but wouldn't it be fairer if everyone faced the same course?" A murmur rippled through the audience. In the front row, an older man who had been nodding along with Richard now looked thoughtful. Richard, sensing he was losing control of the narrative, tried another approach. "Let's get specific then. You mentioned your own experiences. Did you face discrimination? Or did you simply work harder than others around you?" It was a trap question, designed to either make Anthony sound like he was complaining or forced him to criticize his own community. But Anthony was prepared. "It's not an either-or situation, Richard," he replied. "I absolutely worked hard, 16-hour days for years. But I also faced significant barriers." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Would you mind if I shared something with your viewers?" Richard hesitated, then nodded warily. "Go ahead." Anthony held up his phone, showing an email. "This is from the 12th bank that rejected my business loan application. The loan officer accidentally copied me on an internal message that said, and I quote, 'Applicant is well qualified on paper, but these people rarely succeed in tech. Recommend denial.'" The audience grew quiet. On camera, the email was clearly visible, with the damning sentence highlighted. "I have 10 more examples just like this," Anthony continued, his voice still remarkably even. "This isn't about making excuses. It's about acknowledging reality so we can fix it." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going according to plan at all. He glanced at the clock. Still 20 minutes left in the segment. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "one email hardly proves systematic discrimination." Anthony smiled slightly. "You're right. One doesn't. Would you like to see the other 27? For the first time in his broadcasting career, Richard Brooks found himself completely speechless. The silence in the studio stretched uncomfortably. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, while audience members exchanged glances. In the control room, Producers watched in disbelief as the normally quick-witted host struggled to respond. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Well, let's move on to discuss your company's latest." "Actually," Anthony interrupted politely, "I think it's important we finish this conversation since you brought it up." His voice remained calm, but there was a new firmness in his tone. "Your viewers deserve the complete picture." Richard's face flushed red. No guest had ever interrupted him on his own show before. "Mr. Thompson, I decide what we discuss on my program." "Of course you do," Anthony agreed with a nod. "But I was invited here to have a meaningful conversation about economic opportunity. These barriers we're discussing directly impact that topic." In the third row of the audience, a middle-aged woman leaned forward, clearly interested in where this was going. Several others did the same. Richard, sensing he was losing both the argument and his audience, made a critical mistake. His frustration boiled over. "Look," he snapped, "the fact is, your success is the exception, not the rule. Most people from your background don't achieve what you have because they don't have the same work ethic or values. They're looking for handouts instead of opportunities. That's just reality." The studio went completely still. Several audience members looked uncomfortable, even shocked at the overtly racist statement. In the control room, Trent covered his face with his hands. Anthony didn't respond immediately. He took a slow, deliberate breath, then looked directly into the camera. "What you just witnessed," he said clearly, "is exactly what Black Americans face every day. The assumption that our success must be rare, exceptional, or somehow not representative of who we are as a community." He turned back to Richard. "You've just suggested that my entire community lacks work ethic and values. That's not just offensive, it's demonstrably false." From his briefcase, Anthony pulled out a folder and placed it on his lap. "I anticipated this might come up, so I brought some facts with me." He opened the folder and removed several documents. Black Americans start businesses at higher rates than almost any other group, despite receiving less funding. We graduate college at increasing rates despite facing barriers to educational access. Anthony held up a graph. "This shows patent applications by neighborhood in our city, Westside Heights. The area you characterized as having cultural problems produces more patents per capita than any other district except the university area. Innovation thrives there, despite a severe lack of resources." Richard, attempting to regain his footing, scoffed. "Convenient charts and graphs don't change what we all see in the news every day." "You mean like this?" Anthony held up his phone again, showing a news clip of himself being detained by security guards outside an upscale store. The timestamp showed it was from just 3 months ago. In the video, Anthony was wearing an expensive suit, yet security had surrounded him as he exited the building. "This happened to me last quarter, the same week our company was featured on the cover of Business Weekly. I was suspected of shoplifting despite spending over $2,000 in the store." He put the phone down. "This isn't about placing blame, Richard. It's about acknowledging reality so we can address it. The real question isn't why some Black Americans struggle to succeed. The question is why, despite people constantly creating additional obstacles, so many of us excel anyway." Several audience members nodded in agreement. One man in the back spontaneously began to applaud, and others joined in. Richard glanced offstage desperately, making a cutting motion with his hand. "We need to take another break," he said abruptly. "Of course," Anthony replied with a slight smile. "I understand this might be a lot to process." As the on-air sign dimmed, Richard tore off his microphone and stormed toward the production booth, his face contorted with rage. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened. Audience members stood up and approached Anthony, hands extended, wanting to speak with him directly. In 15 years of broadcasting, no one had ever seen anything like it happen on Straight Talk. In the production booth, chaos erupted as Richard burst through the door, his face a mask of fury. "Cut his mic now," he demanded, jabbing his finger toward the control panel. "This isn't what we discussed. He's hijacking my show." Trent stood his ground, surprisingly firm. "Richard, we can't cut his mic. We're live, and half the country is watching. Social media is blowing up. Viewers are actually tuning in, not out." He'd held up his tablet, showing a live feed of Twitter. The hashtag Straight Talk Showdown was trending nationally, with clips of Anthony's responses being shared thousands of times per minute. "I don't care about social media," Richard snapped. "This is my show, and I'm not going to let some." He caught himself before finishing the sentence, suddenly aware of the other producers watching him with uncomfortable expressions. Meanwhile, back on stage, something remarkable was happening. During what should have been a brief commercial break, audience members continued approaching Anthony. A young woman spoke with tears in her eyes about her brother's struggle to get business funding. An older man apologized for assumptions he'd made in the past. The floor director, unsure what to do without Richard, kept signaling for people to return to their seats, but they ignored her. Anthony spoke quietly with each person, listening more than talking. He handed business cards to some, jotted notes for others. His composed demeanor never wavered. In the back of the studio, executives from the network had slipped in, watching with a mixture of concern and fascination. One whispered to another, "This is a disaster, but the ratings are through the roof." When they returned from the extended break, Richard had composed himself somewhat, though a vein still pulsed visibly at his temple. He'd straightened his tie and plastered on a tight smile that looked more like a grimace. "Welcome back to Straight Talk," he said stiffly. "We've been having a spirited discussion with Anthony Thompson about economic opportunities and barriers to success." Anthony nodded politely. "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your willingness to have this difficult conversation." The simple courtesy seemed to throw Richard off balance again. He'd expected continued confrontation, not graciousness. "Well," Richard said, shuffling his papers, "let's move on to discuss." "Actually," Anthony interjected gently, "I think it's important we address what happened before the break." Richard froze. "I don't think that's necessary." "I believe it is," Anthony replied. "Not to embarrass you, but because moments like that, when hidden beliefs become visible, are valuable opportunities for growth." He turned to address the audience directly. "Many of you seem surprised by what was said earlier. That's understandable. But for many Americans, hearing those kinds of statements isn't surprising at all. It's Tuesday." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the audience. "The difference," Anthony continued, "is that most of the time, these comments happen in hiring meetings, loan applications, and housing decisions where they're never recorded or challenged." He reached again into his folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are just a few examples from my own life. A landlord who suddenly claimed an apartment was rented when I showed up in person, a job interview where I was told I wouldn't fit the company culture despite having the top qualifications." Anthony spread the papers on the small table between them. "This isn't about making anyone feel guilty. It's about recognizing problems so we can fix them together." The camera panned across the audience, capturing their attentive faces. Even those who had come as Richard's supporters were listening intently. Richard, seeing he was losing control completely, tried one last tactic. "This all sounds like victimhood to me. At what point do people take personal responsibility?" Anthony smiled slightly. "That's actually a great question, Richard." His voice remained conversational, as if they were discussing this over coffee rather than on national television. "I've taken personal responsibility my whole life, for my education, my career, my company. What I'm asking is that others take responsibility too, for the systems they benefit from and help maintain, often without realizing it." The simplicity and reasonableness of the statement left Richard with nowhere to go. On his own show, in front of his own audience, he found himself cornered not by anger or accusations, but by calm truth-telling backed by evidence. And the cameras caught every moment of his speechless expression. The final segment of Straight Talk began with a studio that felt completely transformed. The energy had shifted dramatically from when the show started. Camera operators exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing something historic in the world of television. Richard sat stiffly in his chair, his usual confident posture replaced by a defensive slump. The last 15 minutes of the show stretched before him like an eternity. He'd lost control not just of his guest, but of his audience and his narrative. "Let's talk about solutions," Anthony suggested, filling the awkward silence Richard had left. "That's ultimately what matters, isn't it?" Richard nodded mechanically, a shadow of his former bombastic self. "What solutions do you propose?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual edge. Anthony leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. First, we need to acknowledge that these barriers exist, not to place blame, but because we can't fix problems we won't admit to. He gestured to include the audience in the conversation. Second, we need better data collection on lending practices, hiring decisions, and educational opportunities. Transparency helps everyone. As Anthony spoke, the camera caught something remarkable happening in the audience. People were taking notes. Some were nodding. Even those who had come wearing shirts with Richard's catchphrases were listening attentively. But most importantly, Anthony continued, we need to understand that removing these barriers benefits everyone. When talent from all communities can thrive, our whole economy grows stronger. It's not about taking opportunities from one group and giving them to another. It's about expanding opportunities for all. In the back of the audience, the network executives whispered among themselves. One made a phone call, speaking quietly but urgently. Richard, attempting to salvage some dignity, straightened in his chair. That sounds nice in theory, but in the real world, resources are limited. Not everyone can succeed. That's true, Anthony agreed. But right now, we're not even letting everyone compete fairly. Imagine a company that only hires from half the talent pool. They're handicapping themselves. Our economy does the same thing when we allow these barriers to persist. He pulled out one last document from his folder. This is data from my own company. When we implemented blind resume screening, removing names and addresses from applications, the diversity of our hires increased by 60%, and our productivity went up by 32% the following year. The simplicity of the example landed with the audience. One man in a business suit nodded emphatically. At the end of the day, Anthony said, looking directly into the camera, this isn't about politics or blame. It's about building a better system that works for everyone. And that starts with honest conversations like this one. For the first time in the interview, many audience members broke into spontaneous applause. A woman in the front row stood up, clapping, and others followed her lead. Within seconds, most of the studio audience was on their feet. Richard looked around in disbelief. This was his audience, people who tuned in daily to hear him tell it like it is. Yet here they were, giving a standing ovation to the man who had systematically dismantled his worldview on live television. The floor director, sensing a moment, signaled to let the applause continue rather than cutting to commercial. In the control room, Trent made a quick decision and put a split screen on air. Anthony's calm, appreciative smile on one side, Richard's stunned expression on the other. As the applause finally died down, Richard realized the show was nearly over. He needed to reclaim some control, to have the last word. He turned to the camera. Well, that's all the time we have for today on Straight Talk. I want to thank. Actually, interrupted the floor director through his earpiece, the network has approved an extension. We're going to continue for another 15 minutes. Richard's face fell as he realized what was happening. The network, his network, had chosen Anthony's message over his carefully crafted persona. Wonderful, Anthony said with genuine enthusiasm. I've brought some additional research on economic mobility that I think your viewers would find fascinating. As the cameras continued rolling, Richard Brooks' empire began to crumble in real time, while Anthony Thompson's quiet dignity built something new in its place, a conversation based on truth, evidence, and mutual respect.